Got bad news. You're all going to die. Every single one of us in this room is going to die. There's no exceptions to this rule. I'm not known for my predictions, but I feel pretty confident about this one. It's a fact. In fact, death is the one prophecy that has never failed. And I'm not disputing the fact that there have been all sorts of amazing, important breakthroughs in technology and in medicine. Here's a graph of life expectancy, even over just the last couple hundred years. It's definitely going in the right direction, right? We're living longer than ever before. This is wonderful. I would never deny that. But the heartbreaking fact remains that of everyone who has been born, the mortality rate remains at a steady 100%. And it's not going anywhere anytime soon. It's just a reality of life. Everyone that's born dies. In 1569, a French nobleman named Michel de Montaigne was thrown off a galloping horse. It was a horrendous accident, and as he lay sort of broken and bloodied on the ground, he was more or less given up for dead. His friends carried his limp body back to his house, and he said he could feel life sort of dancing on the tip of his lips. It was coming in and out of consciousness, and he actually remembered feeling that if he went to sleep, he would never wake up. His grasp on life was that tenuous. And somehow Montaigne does survive. He lives. And this experience fundamentally changes him. He'd sort of idled through life up until this point. He'd mostly done what other people wanted him to do, wasn't particularly motivated. And this experience, this brush with death, this reminder of his mortality, it energizes him. In a few years later, he publishes his first book of essays. He actually invents the essay. He becomes one of Europe's most celebrated writers. He becomes a confidant of the king. He serves as a diplomat. He travels all over Europe. And he even becomes mayor of his hometown. It's a fascinating sort of rejuvenation of his life. And in a way, it's kind of a timeless story, right? A brush with death changes life. We hear about someone who finds out they have cancer and they quit their job and they dedicate themselves to some cause, and it's the turning point in their lives. We hear about someone who finds out they don't have long to live, and it reminds them to reach out and reconnect with someone. It rejuvenates their relationships. And sometimes I think we even think about what we would do if we found out that we had a short time to live. If we were in the doctor's office and the doctor came in and he put his hand on our shoulder and he said, you know, you have cancer, you only have a short time to live. Well, the interesting thing is we do have cancer, right? We do only have a short time to live. The prognosis was terminal the day you were born, right? And that's the bad news, right? The bad news is you're going to die. The good news is, now that I've reminded you of this fact, now that we're here talking about this uncomfortable truth, you have a choice, right? How will you live? How will you respond? Who will you be, knowing that your death is an eventual reality, right? And this is what we're going to talk about today. This is what I'm thinking about. And what's so interesting is that in the modern world, we can lose track of that connection to death, right? In the ancient world, death was a fundamental reality. It was a direct part of people's day-to-day experiences. The plague could come and decimate an entire town or an entire country. A war could break out, and everyone might lose a family member, or they might have to fight it themselves and witness death up close. Death wasn't always so antiseptic and distant, right? We were familiarized. People used to die in their own homes. They had this experience, this day-to-day contact with death. But what's interesting is, even though death was way more familiar to people not long ago, their art, they built forms of reminding themselves of this fact pretty constantly. There's actually two genres of art. There's one, which is vanitas, and if you've probably seen paintings like this, or you might notice this next time you walk through a museum, like half the paintings all have a skull on them for some reason. This is a reminder of mortality. That's what that skull was supposed to represent. This is a famous vanitas painting. It's time in the hourglass. It's life, which is the flower, and then the skull is the death. And you see this in countless paintings across history. You see it on tombstones, and you see it in buildings. What's interesting even is there's another genre called the dance macabre, the dance of death. And there's almost these comical paintings showing skeletons, reminding people that they're mortal. There's a church in Prague that's actually decorated with the bones of the priests and the monks who serve the church. Decorated and scattered throughout Europe is something called a cadaver. They're called cadaver tombs, and they show what the person looked like in life, and then they show what they look like now. And often they have this Latin inscription on them, which just means like, what I am, soon you will be. This morning I went to St. Stephen's Basilica, and you can see a mummified hand that's 1,000 years old. This is the same sort of reminder. These are why we're supposed to see these things. Montaigne actually liked to play a drinking game with his friends. They would hold up a painting or a picture of a skeleton, and they would say, "Drink and be merry, for when you are dead, you will look like this." So inspired by their example, a few years ago, I started carrying a coin in my pocket. It's got the three symbols from that first painting I showed you. And on the front, it says memento mori, remember death. And on the back, it has a quote from Marcus Aurelius, who said, "You could leave life right now." And actually, the full quote is, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." You could leave life right now. And it's true, right? Even with all the medical advancements that we have, even with all the technological breakthroughs that hopefully lie in the future, this won't help you if you get hit by a bus, right? This won't help you if you get drafted to fight in a war. This won't help you if you go out for a walk and your heart just decides to give up, right? These things happen. So I'm interested in how we can use this. I think you should take the thing that you're most afraid of, that you're most intimidated by, that's the most uncertain and uncomfortable, and you should look at it. You should stare at it. You should take these obstacles that we face in life and use them to your advantage. That's what this idea of the obstacle is the way means. It's how do we find a way forward through the thing that is most scary and most uncertain. And the good news is actually, when you stare and think about death, that it can have an energizing effect, right? When you know that your life is short or potentially uncertain, it concentrates your mind. It gives you focus. It gives you priorities. So I write about ancient philosophy. Most of all, I write about the ancient Stoics. And what's interesting about the Stoics is that of all the philosophical schools, the Stoics probably talk about death the most. But they are also the least abstract. So they're not talking about death in the sort of theoretical sense. They're not just exploring what it means. These were people with real jobs. They were the emperor. They were politicians. They were writers. They were merchants. They were entrepreneurs. They were parents. They were thinking about how death could be used in life to have meaning, to have purpose, to have insights. I don't think the Stoics were obsessed with death, nor were those painters we were looking at earlier. I think what they were actually obsessed with was life, not obsessed with death. That's not what this is about. This is about being obsessed with life. This is about living life. So I'm going to give you 3 exercises from my writing from the Stoics that I think will allow you to use this uncertain, scary thing to have a more purposeful existence while you're here. The first exercise comes to us from Seneca. Seneca's an interesting philosopher because, again, he's not an academic. He's a playwright. He's a Roman senator. He actually becomes one of Rome's most influential power brokers. He's the advisor and the tutor to the emperor. And he writes in this letter to a friend, one of his dear friends, he writes a letter about how he should think about death. And he says that the mistake is that we think of death as something in the future, something we're moving towards as time is passing. In fact, he says, death is happening right now. The time that's passed is owned by death. And so what he means is, I showed you that chart earlier, instead of thinking that, for instance, I would be lucky enough to live into my late 70s, I should think instead that I've already died 32 years, right? Seneca says we are dying every day. We're dying every minute. You're dying sitting here listening to me talk, so I hope it's worth it. But we have to get better at managing this precious resource, Seneca is saying, that we fritter away our time. Meanwhile, we strongly and strictly guard our property and our money. But what's more renewable? You can always buy more property. You can always earn more money. What you can't ever do is find or create more time. So we waste this most precious resource on going to meetings that we don't want to go to, signing up for things we don't actually want to do. We don't say no because we're afraid to say no because we don't want to be the bad guy. We give up our most precious resource. We give time away to death. I think what you also take from this, it's an important caveat, is that other people's time is really valuable too. When you take too long in line, when you treat family members poorly, when you go slower than you need to, when you slow other people down, you're taking away time from them that they will never get back. And so that leads us to the next lesson. This is a lesson from Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius is the emperor of Rome. If you don't know who Marcus Aurelius is, he's the guy in the movie Gladiator that Joaquin Phoenix's character kills. But what's interesting is Marcus Aurelius writes this journal. It's called Meditations. What's even more interesting is that he wrote a big chunk of it here in Budapest, right up in the Roman camp, not far from the city. And what he writes in Meditations, he asks this question. He asks it to himself. He never knew that we would read it. But he says, stop whatever you're doing at this moment and ask yourself, am I afraid of death because I won't be able to do this anymore? And by this, he means what we spend so much of our time doing. Are you afraid of death because you won't be able to play video games anymore? Because you won't be able to watch pornography on your computer? Because you won't be able to argue with people you don't know on the internet? Because you won't be able to sit on your couch and get drunk or high? These are not reasons to be afraid of death. You shouldn't be afraid of death at all, he's saying. But what you definitely shouldn't do is be afraid of death. And then when you have life, sit here and waste it on things that don't matter. Seneca says it even more bluntly. He says, you are scared of dying, but tell me, is the kind of life you lead any different than being dead? And there are so many forms of life that are a kind of death, right? A life filled with resentment, a life filled with regret, a life that's all about you, a life that's all about chasing fame or money or power, a life of loneliness or isolation. These are forms of living death. And when we think about our mortality, it wakes us up to that fact. It gives us perspective on how meaningless a lot of the things we spend our time chasing are and the expense that those things come at, right? We put things off to the future. I'll start a family later. I'll follow my dream job later. I'll start that company later. We need more and more time because what we're not doing is being present. We're not taking advantage of what's in front of us right now. We don't want to postpone anything. We want to balance life's books each day. The final lesson comes from Epictetus. Epictetus is a former slave who becomes an influential philosopher. He actually is one of the leading influences in Marcus Aurelius' life. And this is a controversial exercise. It's a little dark, I'll admit. But Epictetus says, as you kiss your child goodnight, whisper to yourself, he may be dead in the morning. He may be dead in the morning. That's heavy, right? But it's important because what that does is it makes you present. It makes you realize what you're doing, how important this thing you're doing is, and how you can't take it for granted. It was said Marcus Aurelius practiced this exercise each evening, which hauntingly was necessary. He unfortunately lost several of his children when the infant mortality rate was much higher than it is now. At Acquium, I was there yesterday, and there was a tombstone of a 10-year-old child put up by his parents that was named after Marcus Aurelius, right? Life is fragile. Life is short. You can't take that for granted. You can't do that. A few years ago, a friend of mine, his name was Seth Roberts, he sent me an email on a Friday afternoon. I saw it. I said, I love Seth, but I'm busy. I'll get to this on Monday. The next day, he went for a hike, and he fell dead of a heart attack. I never got to respond to that. I never got to talk to him that one last time, even though he reached out to me. Another one of my friends, a guy named Brett Barup, I remember I was in the airport in Chicago, and I was thinking, I should send Brett a text. I haven't seen him in a while. And then I was boarding my flight, and I got distracted, and when I landed, I had another text from a different friend who said that Brett had passed away in his sleep that afternoon, and they just found him. And so I'll never get those lost conversations back, but I can learn from that mistake. One of the interesting things about being a parent, about being a busy, ambitious person, you're often rushing, right? You rush through bedtime. You rush through dinner with your spouse. You rush through your drive home. You're rushing. You got things to do. You got places to be. But what the Stoics would ask is, what are you rushing towards? They would say you're rushing towards death. You're rushing away from the people you love. And you're doing it so you can watch more Netflix or respond to more emails or play apps on your phone. This is not why you should be rushing. And so when you realize this, you slow down, you appreciate, you enjoy, you breathe in, you don't take it for granted. In light of our mortality, it's arrogant to blow people off, to ignore them, to defer till later, to make plans for the distant future. It's ridiculous. And instead, you want to take advantage of what's in front of you. You want to seize it. I think there's two ways to think about this memento mori, this meditation on mortality. It can be depressing, it can be sad, or it can connect you with something that deeply makes us human. As I was standing in this 2,000-year-old amphitheater up the river, I could just feel the people that had been there before, how many generations of human beings had lived and died, and how long this was going on. This is a vintage shirt. Sometimes I think about the person who wore it before me and if they're still alive or not, or what they experienced. In 2003, the country musician Rosanne Cash lost her mother, her father, her stepmother, and her sister, all of relatively natural causes. And this was heartbreaking. But what she said she took from this was a realization that everyone has experiences like this, and everyone always has had experiences like this, and that it reminds you of the little pleasantries in life, the connections, the meaning, the relationships we have with people, how important they are, and how we can't take them for granted, and how, she said, loss is the great unifier, the terrible club that we all eventually belong to. But I think it's just a club that humans have always belonged to and always will belong to. We're the only species that knows we're mortal, and it seems strange to ignore that, to pretend that it's not true. And instead, we want to use it to find meaning and purpose and clarity. Over the last few years, I got to know a man in Austin. His name was Richard Overton. He was born in 1906. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt was president of the United States. There were still people potentially who were born in the 1700s who were alive when Richard was born. The car is new. So many things haven't happened. And there he is. He's born. He serves in World War II. He fights in the Pacific, comes home to Texas, and he survives segregation. And he builds a life for himself. And I got to know him. He was a wonderful man. He lived a fantastically interesting life. He would smoke cigars every day. He would drink whiskey, and he ate ice cream, which tells you all the things that doctors tell you are really important. Maybe they don't matter. But he was always surrounded by friends, surrounded by family. He knew all his neighbors. He showed me a tree he planted in his front yard that was 70 years old. That's how long he'd lived in this house. And he was a wonderful man. And I learned two things from Richard. Number one, that you go when you go, right? That I never felt from Richard that 112 years old was not enough, right? There's all these people that want to live forever, that are afraid to die. When you meet really old people, you don't get that sense that they're hanging on, that what you actually get is presence, and you get gratitude, and you get perspective. But one day I asked Richard, I said, Richard, how do you live to be 112? What's your secret? I said, do you just take it day by day? And he said, nah, at my age, you take it day by night. And I think that's an insight worthy of the Stoics. You can't get too far ahead of yourself. You can't take anything for granted. You can't defer things into the future. You have to be present. You have to enjoy what's there in front of you. You have to connect. And Richard passed away at the beginning of this year, buried with some of his favorite things you can see there. But he's a wonderful man. They even named the street that he lived on after him, and they're probably going to turn his house into a museum. I feel very lucky to have connected with someone like that, and it connected with this practice that I'm talking to you guys about today. The last lesson I would give you, the last thought, came to me when I was on a run in Philadelphia last year. I was really busy. I was finishing up a book that I wanted to be a success. I was trying to build my business. I was about to give a talk. And I went for this run, and I was running through this old neighborhood in Philadelphia, outside Philadelphia, and I came across this old Revolutionary War cemetery. And it was filled with all these enormous tombstones, erected in people's honors with statues and all the things they accomplished. And one of the oldest ones was sitting there on the ground. It wasn't high, it wasn't big, it was very quiet, very subdued. It was from one of the oldest people in the cemetery. She actually died in 1805, so she was born in the mid 1700s. And on this tombstone, you can barely read it, but it says, "Verses on tombstones are but idly spent. The living character is the monument." And I think that's the essence of what I want to leave you guys with, that you get one life. We don't know what happens to us when we die. We don't know what happens after. Some people think they know, but we don't know, right? And so what matters is what you do now. What matters is what you do with the time in front of you, because that's the only thing that's certain. The present moment is the only thing that's certain. And so you can't delay, you can't waste, you can't assume anything. You must take advantage of what's in front of you